So it looks like August is going to be joining us momentarily. I'm going to go ahead and kick us off because we have a bunch of introductions to make. So everyone, welcome to the American Revolution and the Left, hosted by the Platypus Affiliated Society. My name is Wentai, and I will be your moderator this evening. Hi, August. Welcome to the panel. The Platypus Affiliated Society, established in December 2006, organizes reading groups, public fora, research, and journalism focused on problems and tasks inherited from the old 1920s to 30s, new 1960s to 70s, and post-political 1980s to 90s left for the possibilities of emancipatory politics today. We have chapters around the world, from Los Angeles to Leipzig, Austin to Athens, and Chicago to Shanghai. During the current lockdown, we're hosting a number of online reading groups and panel events, such as this one. Starting next week, we are hosting 3 Introduction to Platypus virtual reading groups via Zoom, as well as our regular primary Marxist syllabus in different locations. If you want to find out more about those reading groups, you can go to platypus1917.org/virtual. I've also posted the links in the chat box. So as part of this weekend's virtual convention, we're also hosting 2 panels tomorrow. Those are going to be Bonapartism, How is the State Revolutionary, at 2 p.m. Central Time, and Socialism in the 21st Century at 6 p.m. Central Time. They will all be live on Zoom, and the links will be in the chat box. Also, I'd like to mention we publish a monthly open submission journal, the Platypus Review. The latest issue, number 125, is online now, so please go ahead and check it out. And you can also check out our podcast, Shit Platypus Says, for your dose of the commentary on the left, which is published regularly on SoundCloud and Apple Podcasts. So please check that out, share, subscribe, give us a review. And without further ado, I'm happy to finally open our panel, The American Revolution and the Left. So tonight, we've asked our speakers the following. How was the American Revolution revolutionary? Does the left today inherit any of the revolutionary tasks of 1776? Should the left break with or build on the legacy of the American Revolution? Now, I'd like to extend a very warm welcome and our gratitude in advance to our speakers this evening, and I'm going to take this opportunity to introduce our speakers in the order that they'll be speaking. So first, Alex Gourevitch is an associate professor of political science at Brown University. He is the author of From Slavery to the Cooperative Commonwealth, Labor and Republican Liberty in the 19th Century. He is currently working on a book on the political theory of strikes. He currently works and lives in his house with occasional walks back and forth in his driveway. Second, Jamal Abed-Rabbo is a member of Chicago DSA and a founder of the DSA Class Unity Caucus. He holds a PhD in history from the University of Chicago. Third, August Nimtz is professor of political science and African American and African Studies at the University of Minnesota. His most recent book is Marxism versus Liberalism, Comparative Real-Time Political Analysis. And last but not least, we have Pamela Nogales. Pamela Nogales received her PhD in American history from New York University, where she defended her dissertation, Reform in the Age of Capital, the Transatlantic Roots of the American Reform Tradition, 1828 to 76. Pamela is a founding member of the Platypus Affiliated Society and co-host of the podcast Shit Platypus Says. She currently lives and works in Berlin. Now, each panelist will have 8 to 10 minutes for opening remarks and then 3 to 4 minutes to respond to one another. When you have 5 minutes left, 1 minute left, and no time left, I will hold up a time card in my screen that you can see. After you respond to each other, we're going to move into the audience Q&A. When we go to the panelists' responses to each other, I'm going to start asking the audience to begin submitting their questions using the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Please use your name when you're submitting a question, and I will read them out loud for the panelists to respond to. So please go ahead with your opening remarks, Alex.
Thank you very much, Wentai, for that very kind introduction and for inviting me to this. I'm really happy to be here, or to not be here, as it were. So I guess what I'd like to say is that I think the American Revolution was revolutionary because, like many of the New World revolutions and some that followed in Europe, it introduced a series of radical ideas about freedom and self-rule. The revolutionaries declared as a matter of practice what Jean-Jacques Rousseau had declared as a matter of idea, which is that the only legitimate form of government is a self-governing republic. The people must be sovereign. And this meant that, as Payne said, hereditary and other hierarchical forms of power were in principle and now in practice illegitimate. And it also meant taking seriously the idea that's really first fully articulated in Federalist Paper number 1, that it's possible to remake political institutions according to reflection and choice, rather than accident and force. And I think that's a very revolutionary idea, and it goes hand in hand with the idea that government is for and by the living, which is why the people must rule. I think it's important to observe that the reason it was revolutionary was not just that there were many such ideas at work during the revolution, but that the revolutionaries invented actual social and political practices to make the idea of self-rule real. So you have things like popular ratification of constitutions, constitutional conventions, the people out of doors, all of these new actual practices, which were really new and novel and revolutionary. And these were also applied to the domain of the economy. Property and labor were to be organized so that citizens' economic independence would support their political independence. And so again, these actual practices are part of why I think the revolution deserves to be called revolutionary. Now, I understand why people sometimes doubt this, or if they don't doubt that it was revolutionary, they doubt that there was anything to admire. And that's because many of the revolutionaries also worked to undermine its universality. They proclaimed the equal freedom of all, but it turned out that they really thought, or in practice defended, institutions in which the freedom of some presupposed the subjection or even enslavement of others. It was said that freedom was only possible for white men, or for Protestant white men, but sometimes amounted to the same. The idea that those who had property were capable of and should have a right to self-rule, but not those who didn't. And their lack of property was therefore seen as evidence, not of oppression or injustice, but of their incapacity for freedom. And I think that if it were true that the ideals and the practices that were inaugurated by the American Revolution were exhausted by or logically terminated in slavery and bourgeois property, then there would be reason for the left to look on the American Revolution as an event of historical interest, but having no continuity with the actual politics and ideas of the left. But I think it would be a mistake to think that way about the American Revolution. I mean, even at the time, many of the ideas and practices were seized upon by those who sought to criticize these efforts to limit equal freedom to certain groups. So Manisha Sinha, in her book, The Slave's Cause, about abolitionism, shows how at the very moment of the American Revolution, immediately afterwards, many early abolitionists used the ideals and sought to even use some of the institutions of the early American Republic to criticize slavery and to point out the obvious hypocrisy. And more broadly, I think it makes sense to stand in the tradition of thinking about the revolution as an unfinished revolution. This is, to my mind, the way the left should think about it. And there's a number of ways of thinking about what that means. A group that I have spent some time thinking about and trying to write about is the labor Republicans. And they were the ones who saw the American Revolution in just these terms. They were a group of workers who thought that the revolutionary idea of popular sovereignty and collective self-rule had only partially been realized by the revolutionaries themselves. And they had three basic reasons for thinking that way. One was the very obvious thought, which I just mentioned, which is that it was just fundamentally hypocritical to proclaim that all human beings were capable of self-rule and living as free equals among others, and then to institutionally deny them the capacity to exercise and develop those capacities, to develop and exercise those capacities. And so the revolution or the existing institutions were violating the spirit of the revolution by restricting access to the institutions, the property, the forms of labor that supported popular self-government. The second reason that I think the labor Republicans are particularly interesting for the left as a perspective on the American Revolution as an unfinished revolution is that they thought that the political economy of American society had failed to catch up with or fully realize the promise of its formal democratic institution. So, yep, it's backwards. The principle of popular sovereignty, no, it's fine. The principle of popular sovereignty, they said, needed to be applied to the world of work and property. So one of the famous phrases was they said that there needs to be a people in industry if there is to be a people in government. Or they spoke of wanting to republicanize labor and not just republicanize government. And what that meant was ultimately abolishing wage labor and substituting a form of cooperative control over work and put it in its place. That's what it meant for the people to be self-governing in all aspects of their lives, and therefore to fully realize the promise of the American Revolution. And that required democratic rule over the economy, a form of rule that could not be limited by pre-existing moral claims to property or other conceptions of sort of pre-political private property rights. And it's notable that quite early on, even in the 1820s, some of these figures were arguing for using constitutional conventions, popular political gatherings, in order to basically, for a moment, expropriate all the property in a particular state and then redistribute it on an equal basis to everyone in that state, no matter their gender, no matter their race, so that everyone could actually enjoy the kind of economic independence that they needed to be self-governing citizens. So that was the second thought about how to transform the political economy so it realized the ideals of the revolution. And then this is the last thought, and I'll just end with this, which is what was so interesting about the labor Republicans was that they saw in the American Revolution not just institutions or ways of thinking, but the idea that those who are denied the freedom that they deserve should be the agents of their own emancipation. That was the true, deepest revolutionary character of the American Revolution, and why they saw themselves as carrying forward the project of the American Revolution by creating a political party of workers, their own independent forms of organization and education, so that that subject class of workers who are not, in fact, economically independent could use their own collective efforts to transform the society, impose democratic control on the economy, and live as self-governing Republican citizens. And to me, that idea of self-emancipation of those who lack freedom that they deserve is the real nerve of all left-wing politics. And if the labor Republicans could get it out of the American Revolution, I see no reason why the left can't either. And that's why I think it makes most sense to see the American Revolution as truly revolutionary, but an unfinished revolution.
Great, thank you so much, Alex. Jamal, do you want to go ahead?
All right, thank you. Thanks to Platypus for inviting me to this panel. I'm not entirely sure why you did, because unlike the other panelists, my history degree is not in anything relevant to the topic at hand. I studied medieval Islamic legal history. So I will keep my comments brief, because I think Alex, Pamela, and August probably have much more interesting things to say than I. I thought Alex's discussion was enlightening and more or less entirely correct. I would just add that there are two specific issues where we see very clearly this tension between the unfulfilled promise of the American Revolution on the one hand, and the left's sort of ambivalence toward it on the other. The first is freedom of speech, which of course has historically been one of the most important safeguards in the American constitutional structure. And there are not many. It is on the whole a regime that by developed country standards is relatively hostile to the left, but it is one of those that has benefited the left quite greatly over the course of American history. And over the last several years, we've seen many parts of the American so-called left basically set about undermining the very principle that freedom of speech, you know, is important or should be valued. We'll see how long they keep that up, but on the other hand, we have a particularity of the American constitutional arrangement that has stunted the growth of the American left, and that is the unusual, by today's standards, electoral system. We've seen how deeply and how much difficulty the American left has had in constituting a basic social democratic or labor party, which in almost every other developed country, this happened many decades ago. And this is another thing that I think the American left has been asleep at the wheel on. We're seeing right now with the Bernie campaign, it is untenable to try to establish a workers' party in the shell of a party that is not primarily comprised of working class people. And we have two parties in the United States that are both similarly hostile to working class political organization. But the jump from this arrangement to one where we have a working class party that could actually contest power, there's this great fissure, you know, between where we are now and where we would like to be. And I think, you know, I would propose that one of the only ways we're going to get across that chasm is to take seriously the task of fulfilling just one of these initial aims of the American Revolution, which is a true democratic system, unencumbered by the various mechanisms currently in place to shut down third-party and working-class political organization. So with that, I yield my time. I'm very interested to see what Pam and August have to say.
Great, thank you. And August, welcome to the panel. I'm sorry I didn't have a chance to say hello before, but please go ahead.
Thanks. Sorry I was a bit late, and thanks for inviting me. And I must say now, unfortunately, I will have to bail out at about 7 because of a commitment I have at 7:30. Yes, I think it's important that we're having this discussion. I guess we have to thank the editors of the New York Times with their 1619 project that has opened up this discussion, and one which we very much need. Thinking about the American Revolution, at least for me, I'm always thinking about the world in which we live at this moment. And here you see the limitations of the US Revolution around the question of federalism, a fragmented political system, and in which governors are doing their thing at the local level. And so we are unable to coordinate the kind of collective response. We see how institutions and institutional arrangements, in other words, are getting in the way of solving a collective problem, and that's the problem we're faced with at this moment. That was the baggage of the past, and but as a famous civil rights worker once said, leader once said, we work with what we got. That's the hand that history dealt us. What came out of the American Revolution. I think the American Revolution should be treated as a phenomenon that comes in 2 phases. It's what I call the revolutionary phase, and I think the Declaration of Independence represents the best of the American Revolution. It came out of a popular movement. There's a great book that's come out recently by Mary Beth Norton on 1774, and what happened in that moment, it's a key moment that's neglected, that long year, as she calls it, and you really get a chance to see. It was indeed a popular movement, and contrary to the editors of the New York Times, it wasn't motivated by trying to save slavery. It came about because indeed taxation without representation was real. It was a real issue in that particular context. It was a complicated story, but nevertheless, I think the Declaration of Independence represents the best. The role of someone like Thomas Paine in that process. But when we get to Philadelphia, I think I consider that the thermidor of the American Revolution. This is when the counter-revolution begins. We should never forget what came out of Philadelphia, the document, the Constitution. Never, ever in the document does the word democracy appear. The framers made it very clear. This was not about democracy. This was not about popular sovereignty. The most progressive features, of course, were added out of a duress. I'm referring to the Bill of Rights. And one thing that we've learned about the Bill of Rights is an important lesson is that they don't become a reality really until the 20th century. That's when the Bill of Rights are actually a living document, not in most of the 19th century. During the Civil War, for example, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, and so on was severely limited. And that's an interesting discussion. And thinking about civil liberties and thinking about civil liberties today, at this very moment, that's a big issue. The question of the collective interests and those of civil liberties. So I think the most progressive feature of the revolution was the phase one, the Declaration of Independence. It's no accident that the keys to the Bastille are in Mount Vernon. They were sent by the revolutionaries in Paris. They sent those keys to George Washington because they saw what took place here, that is the fight for independence, as being as a progressive feature. And looking at the slaves, and many of them were torn about which sides to take, but many of them, like Phyllis Wheatley, saw this as an opportunity to fight for national independence had implications for the slavery question. But again, by the time you get to Philadelphia, I think it's an effort on the part of the framers, the people at Philadelphia, to put the genie back into the bottle. And we know there were a number of reasons why they were very fearful of this popular revolution. The question of foreclosures, and it led to Shays' Rebellion in Western Massachusetts, was one of the reasons that Washington decided to come out of retirement. This was important to try to put a lid on this. And the other major concern was that there were state legislators who were printing paper money, especially in Rhode Island and elsewhere in New England. This was a big concern on the part of those who lent money to the Continental Congress. And their fear that paper money would devalue currency, and therefore they would come out as losers. And this is why so much in the Constitution, so much of the Constitution deals with contracts and property. The property question in contracts is a key element, and we should never forget the fourth article about slaves as property, even though some historians don't want to admit that was indeed the substance of what the article, in the interpretation, most importantly interpreted by the Supreme Court. So yes, there are many Southern slave owners felt that the Constitution defended the institution of slavery, and with good reason, thought that. So it would take another revolution, what I call the Second American Revolution, the new birth of freedom. The Civil War was a crucial. That was the next big one. And so I think those are my comments for now.
Great, thank you so much, August. Pamela?
Thanks. In 1848, the European parliamentarians in Paris and Frankfurt modeled themselves after the American statesmen. They asked the Americans for the founding documents of the Republic, its Declaration of Independence, and its Constitution. By invoking the memory of 1776, liberals reinvigorated a conversation among American reformers over the revolutionary legacy of the nation's founding. This left a lasting impression on the political thinking of an entire generation, but especially among the abolitionists. It was in the wake of 1848, where Frederick Douglass departed from William Lloyd Garrison's approach of moral suasion, that is the appeal to morality, and in calling the Constitution a, quote, glorious liberty document, moved closer to the political abolitionist Gerrit Smith and his project of the Liberty Party. The occasion, wrote Douglass, is not one of color, but of universal man. Our brave old earth rocks with mighty agitations. Whether we look at home or abroad, liberty greets us with the same majestic air. We live in times which have no parallel in the history of the world. The grand commotion is universal and all-pervading. Douglas identified the democratic revolutions in Europe as an unprecedented opening in the fight against what he called tyranny, which he understood as the enslavement of human beings by arbitrary systems of hierarchy enforced by bayonet. This conflict was fought on multiple theaters and across centuries. It was carried out into the 19th century through the memory of the American and the French revolutions. Thus, for Douglas, the contest was not national, but, as he said, universal, a fundamental global conflict because its outcome would decide the reach of human emancipation. Those were the stakes of the democratic revolution for Douglas, and it was at this juncture when he broke with Garrison and his call for disunion. Throughout the 1850s, the Garrisonian papers in Boston and New York displayed bold headlines with the slogan, "No union with slaveholders." The message was presented in a compelling performance at an abolitionist rally on the 4th of July in 1854, when Garrison held a copy of the US Constitution and branded the document the source and parent of all of the atrocities, a covenant with death and an agreement with hell. Garrison lit the Constitution on fire while he cried out, "So perish all compromises with tyranny." But it was precisely this assumption that Douglas rejected. Instead, he argued that the founding documents of the Republic were a living promise of the nation's, quote, "yet undeveloped destiny." As Douglas understood it, the American Revolution remained the promise of liberty. Why? Because, as he put it, the living shall make it so. So what was the universal promise for liberty of 1776 that Douglas held so dear? The American and French revolutions were part of the ongoing process of bourgeois revolutions inaugurated by the Dutch Revolt and deepened with the English Revolution of the mid-17th century and the Glorious Revolution of 1688. As James Vaughan has written for the Platypus Review, these constituted an ongoing process of bourgeois revolution because they were all moments when men and women with increasing self-consciousness attempted to realize the potential for human emancipation contained within the crisis and breakdown of traditional agrarian civilization. As a whole, the revolutionary challenge to traditional society disrupted the great chain of being, the order of rank and privilege that determined one's life trajectory at birth. Within this divinely ordained hierarchy, one could not make oneself in the world through one's labor and effort, that is, through one's productive activity. The founding of the American Republic disrupted the social order. The American, like the French Revolution, was one great revolt of the Third Estate, that is, of those who work, against the world that consigned them to labor and toil off of the stage of history. While the leading figures of these revolutions included radical aristocrats and clergymen, in establishing bourgeois right, they liberated men from arbitrary hierarchies and set laboring activity within civil society. That is to say, they transformed labor from the meaningless toil of the many who were destined to perish into the essential activity of the reproduction of society. Leaders of the revolution were not beholden to the bourgeoisie or to a future capitalist class, but rather acted on behalf of the Third Estate, which in the 18th century included merchants in Amsterdam, planters in Virginia, shopkeepers in London, artisans in Brussels, laborers in Paris, and slaves in Saint-Domingue. The American and French revolutions thus brought the workers of the world onto the stage of history for the first time by emancipating labor and unshackling the exchange of its products. Contrary to Hannah Arendt's argument that the American Revolution was a mere political revolution, by establishing a republic, the revolt of the Third Estate led a fundamental transformation of society. This revolutionary kernel at the heart of the American Republic survived the 18th century and was invoked in the contest for a shorter working day throughout the 19th century. From the 1830 onward, calls for shorter hours placed the producing classes as leading figures in the democratization of industry. workers calling for shorter hours mounted a reinterpretation of the American Revolution in light of the historically unprecedented conditions facing the Republic working citizens. In the language of the 18th century, they denounced the aristocratic tendencies of factory owners, who they commonly referred to as King George. Reformers used the language of rights, but the content of these demands was distinctly social. Consider, for example, laborers who demanded to break with the social tyranny of factory operators and their calls to the Massachusetts legislature to curtail the employer's monopoly over machinery on the basis that running the machines until sundown infringed on the workers' sole property, that is, their labor time. It was their understanding that if social conditions robbed working citizens from the time required to be part of a free-thinking polity, the American Republic remained fundamentally unfree. In other words, since the emerging divisions within civil society undermined Republican liberty, political right was necessary but insufficient to sustain the free republic. Thus, they argued that the revolution's true aspirations had yet to be realized. Workers called for greater citizenship time at 4th of July celebrations and connected the nation's founding documents to the promise for shorter hours. Newspapers quoted Benjamin Franklin's prognosis of a future 4-hour workday. Franklin, the most famous of Philadelphia's artisans, who clearly, so clearly as to almost be trite, as Marx later wrote, argued in 1731 that labor was the source of value. It is no wonder then why throughout the shorter hours movement, the American Revolution loomed large, from New York's artisan shops to New England's factory girls, to the working men philosopher and leader of the 8-hour movement, Ira Stewart, all the way into the 20th century, as invoked by the Socialist Party orator, Eugene Debs. The American Revolution was understood as a promise for the emancipation of labor. Brief remarks will have to suffice at this point in the barbarism of the 20th century, when the left becomes implicit in the abuse of 1776 and partook in the degradation of its legacy. In the 1930s, American Stalinists colluded in the nationalization of the American Revolution by shifting its attention from the class struggle in civil society to a spot in FDR's New Deal coalition. They thus dropped the task of the independent political self-consciousness of the working class. The history of the American Revolution at this point became propaganda for a political reconciliation between Democrats and communists. They used 1776 to leave behind the struggle for socialism, that is, the emancipation of labor from capital, to a national political struggle under the Bonapartist state. As Clint Montgomery has recently pointed out in the Platypus Review, to this day, in the office of the Communist Party of America in San Francisco, there hangs a picture of Barack Obama. Most recently, the call for a revolution has been taken up by the Democratic Socialists of America and their campaign for Bernie Sanders for president, forgetting perhaps a key insight provided by Eugene Debs when he said that, quote, "Every hint at a public ownership is now called socialism, without reference to the fact that there can be no socialism and that public ownership means practically nothing so long as the capitalist class is in control of national government. Government ownership of public utilities means nothing for labor under capitalist ownership of government." We may not, like Frederick Douglass, live in revolutionary times, but perhaps the least we can do is retain the promises of 1776 for the future, to leave open the task of the emancipation of labor and denounce the enslavement of the working class to the capitalist state rather than welcome it. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you all so much for your opening remarks. So before we go on to the panelists' responses, I'm just going to give the audience a quick reminder. You can begin submitting your questions in the Q&A box using your name. If your question is directed at one of our panelists in particular, please indicate that in your question. So now I'd like to turn it over back to Alex. Maybe we can start with you and you guys can respond to each other's remarks for 3 to 4 minutes each.
Well, I'm still processing what was said, so I'm not sure I know exactly how I feel about what was said. Let me note a couple areas of agreement. First, which is, first, I agree with August that we have to think about the American Revolution as having in itself some revolutionary and counter-revolutionary moments. It's clear that the Constitution not only was a kind of counter-revolutionary moment, insofar as it was a reaction to Shays' Rebellion, an attempt to create a more centralized executive power able to suppress rebellions within the United States of all kinds of workers, not just or even primarily slaves, actually, I think they had in mind, but propertyless workers. So to suppress precisely the energies that Pamela mentioned. But I don't think it's so easy to, and then the institutions actually created by the Constitution were clearly deeply anti-democratic, or at least an attempt to create layers of anti-democratic institutions on top of the fundamentally democratic character of these political institutions, since they still had to recognize that the people were sovereign, the people had to ratify the Constitution. So I just want to agree and highlight that, but I think somewhat unlike the standard sort of view of that as a thermidor, it seems to me that what you get is a failure to fully extinguish many of the revolutionary aspects of the American Revolution. So in the standard model in which the thermidor stands as the end, I don't think that's as true in the American case. And in particular in the 1790s, when you get the first real movement of workers now organizing themselves independently as workers, demanding equal rights under the banner of Jeffersonian republicanism. So I think there's I want to agree with August, but with a kind of a bit of a dissent. I think that it isn't so clear that what the Constitution even really meant is what it eventually became by the end of the 19th century. And then the other thing is to sort of, I want to pick up and maybe we'll discuss more the question of whether what is most revolutionary and radical about the American Revolution is that it created the idea and possibility of a democratic electoral system, or what it did is negate that very thing. And I'm inclined to think that if you look at some of the state constitutions, like the Pennsylvania state constitutions, there you get something like the truly radical unicameral majoritarian form of democracy that would have been a real institutional inheritance of, and therefore revolutionary, one institutional form that the revolutionary inheritance of that the American Revolution could have taken. But that isn't what we got at the national and even at most state levels. And so I think in terms of the political practices, the most radical ones we get are the practice of constitution making, popular sovereignty, the idea that fundamentally the people are the sole and unique source of authority of these institutions. And when we look at our institutions, I think that's what remains sort of at bottom and underneath all of these institutions to pull on. What we don't have are good examples of a proper normal way of democratic ruling with sort of unicameral majoritarian lawmaking. And I'll leave the rest of my thoughts for the discussion.
Great. I'm actually going to ask August to go next. Sorry, Jamal, just because August, you had mentioned you have a time constraint. So why don't you go ahead?
Thanks. Yeah, I think once again, I think the American Revolution, the original one, the fight for struggle for self-determination, came in two phases. There was 1776, epitomizes the best, in my opinion, of the revolution. And then there's Philadelphia and the Constitution in 1787. And once again, we should never forget that the word democracy never appears in the document. And particularly striking in none of the post-Civil War amendments does the word democracy ever appear. I understand there's an amendment that's being proposed to get rid of Citizens United. And this Brennan, I think, has formulated the amendment to add to the Constitution, but he couldn't bring himself to add democracy to that amendment. I had a smart student many years ago came up with an explanation why in the subsequent amendments, democracy never appeared. It's because the people who were writing those amendments were lawyers, and who, as lawyers, they wanted to maintain faith to the original document. The original document was about bringing in a Republican form of government, not bringing in a democracy. I think Marx was right. Yeah, I'm glad Pamela raised Douglas. I've been reading Douglas recently, and I think Douglas was wrong. I think it was aspirational on this is what he was hoping for. And I think Marx was correct when Marx said, when Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, Lincoln tore up the Constitution. That was the language that Marx employed to describe what had happened. And certainly it was a violation of the Fifth Amendment, the property question. But it was to give, the more important thing that Marx understood and that Douglas didn't understand is that constitutions are living documents. They are decided in struggle, what a constitution actually means. That's decided on the battlefield. That was decided on the battlefield of the Civil War, its meaning. And we should also never forget what the Constitution, the reality of the Constitution is what happened in 2000, year 2000. And that is one person, unelected, for a lifetime position, decided who would be president of the United States. That was all done legally under the Constitution. I'm referring to Bush v. Gore, the 5-4 decision of the Supreme Court. A decision that flew in the face of popular sovereignty. And again, it was not done in secret. You could see it on C-SPAN, and it was the Constitution. That was the Constitution, the reality of the U.S. Constitution. So it's a flawed document, in my opinion, and indeed, like any document, like any constitution, as Marx understood, its meaning, what it actually means, will be decided on in struggle.
Great. Thank you so much, August. Jamal, do you want to go ahead?
If August has to leave, I would be happy allowing other panelists to engage him for a little bit before making my comments. If that, I'm not sure if that's easy to arrange.
Sorry, I didn't realize I was muted. I think maybe what we can do is if you and Pam could make your comments a little bit brief, a little slightly more brief, then we can go directly into the Q&A and make sure that we get enough August time.
All right, sure. I'm always happy to promote August time. I think that this is an interesting panel because we all seem to be more or less in agreement on the core question, which to my understanding is not usually how platypus panels tend to go. So I guess I will cause trouble by asking Pam if she thinks that the Bernie Sanders campaign has gotten us further from fulfilling the promise of the American Revolution, or if she agrees with the DSA that it has been helpful in some capacity. And that's all I have to say.
Okay, thank you. Pam, go ahead.
To respond to August quickly, I think that it's this question of when Douglas is arguing for the Constitution as a glorious liberty document, who he's responding to are people that are calling for disunion. And so I think that the political intervention that Douglas is making is to say that to call for disunion leaves the slaves sort of adrift, right? And it's the Constitution that brings people into a struggle, a common struggle for liberty. And so it's this particular intervention. But I don't think that he would disagree that it's a living document. But because you brought up Marx and Lincoln, and maybe we can talk about this during the Q&A, this issue of democracy keeps coming up, and whether or not the revolution was democratic, and does it become less democratic? Does it go through a phase of sort of counter-revolution where it's no longer democratic? And I guess we have to kind of be with Marx in the 19th century as well, and raise the issue of a kind of crisis of bourgeois society and that capitalist democracy itself is a problem for the realization for socialism. And so maybe what we can discuss during the Q&A is the relationship between democracy and socialism. Is socialism just the kind of reaffirmation of democracy? Or is it a kind of going beyond democracy? Is the emancipation of labor not just a kind of universalization of democracy, but something other than a democratic society? As far as Bernie Sanders and the DSA, I think that if the struggle for socialism is in part to build an independent working class movement that is self-conscious of its political power, that its attachment to the Democratic Party is undermines that project. And so the question is whether or not the DSA can advance the struggle for socialism outside of the Democratic Party. And it seems to me that all of the energy into an electoral strategy undermines the struggle for socialism.
Excellent. Let me thank you guys again for all of your wonderful opening remarks and your responses to each other. Okay, we already have a sizable list of questions for you guys. So let's just jump right into it. The first question is coming from Danny Jacobs, and it's a question for Alex and August. So I'm just gonna read his question out to you guys. Why is the sovereignty of the people being identified with democracy? Are not the anti-democratic institutions, i.e. checks on majority rule, actually part of the expression of the sovereignty of the people, of the defense of individual rights from coercion by the majority? So that question's for Alex and August.
Am I muted? Well, August, why don't you go first since you're under time?
No, I'm dying to hear your answer.
Yeah. I think that popular sovereignty has a Janus-based relationship to democracy. So I think that Democrats should be, small d Democrats, yeah, should be committed to popular sovereignty, the idea that the people should rule themselves. But insofar as popular sovereignty is the form that the people who want to govern themselves give to themselves in the moment of writing a constitution, it's true that the people can sometimes write constitutions that actually undermine or limit the daily practice of self-governing. This is a kind of one of these contradictions of democracy and its relationship to the state in a modern society. So I don't think there's an inherent conflict. If I understood the question right, I don't think there's an inherent conflict. I don't think it's true that popular sovereignty requires limiting the majority. I think there's a natural connection between ordinary democratic lawmaking and popular sovereignty, but it's not like always a necessary relation, because sometimes the people can write constitutions and ratify constitutions that actually undermine the daily activities of self-government. As it happens, I think a lot of the practices in our electoral system and the legal precedents and so on that constrain democracy are not actually a product of the Constitution. Some are, obviously, like the Electoral College or the basically unrevisability of the Senate, the massively unequal representation that the Senate creates for people, and a number of other things. But things like judicial review, the enormous constraints on third parties, disenfranchisement, all these other things are not, in fact, in any way a product even of our Constitution, let alone popular sovereignty. They're a product of the most undemocratic institutions of our society expropriating or appropriating powers to themselves that simply weren't even there in the Constitution. So judicial review is invented in the early 19th century. It's not reasonably interpreted as something that's part of the Constitution to begin with. So just to restate, I think that anyone committed to democracy is also going to defend popular sovereignty. But it is the case that sometimes popular sovereignty can be exercised in a way that creates constitutions that limit ordinary democratic lawmaking.
Yeah, I don't think there's any inherent contradiction between popular sovereignty and democracy. It's true that young Marx made much more usage of popular sovereignty or the sovereignty of the people. You see that in his writings, rather than emphasizing democracy. Democracy doesn't get a lot of attention. Really, it's the sovereignty of the people. Human emancipation is what the young Marx has his focus on. I'll take advantage of the question to answer, I think, something that Wintai asked about the question of socialism and democracy. I think it's useful in a manifesto. I think it's instructive in a manifesto when you get to that third section in the manifesto, which is not read enough, distinctions that Marx and Engels make between the different tendencies in 1848. You will see that they didn't refer to themselves as social democrats. They referred to their tendency as communists or the scientific communists. And because of the 1848 revolutions, they reluctantly, in my opinion, began using the label social democracy or social democrats. That wasn't their preference, but they lived in the real world, real political world, and that's the language that was being used at that time. And certainly Lenin, when he got the opportunity coming out of the First World War, abandoned that label in order to distinguish between what the Bolsheviks had done in relationship to the First World War, not voting for the war credits, and distinguishing communists from socialists and social democrats. But he proudly wore that label. Lenin proudly wore that label up until about 1914. That is the social democratic label.
Great, thank you guys. I'm gonna, oh, sorry, I thought I heard something. I'm gonna ask one more question. This one is from Aaron Haygood, and this is also kind of in line with the last question. It's also a question about democracy. So I just wanted to, since we're already on that topic, let's just take this opportunity to drill in. So this is Aaron's question. Engels has said that the proletarian revolution for socialism takes the appearance of the demand for democracy. The rise of socialism also coincides with the expansion of the franchise, with the expansion of the demands for mass democracy in the mid-19th century. What is the role of democracy in the bourgeois revolution? And what is its role in the proletarian revolution? How do the two differ? I'm asking this question because on the panel, there have been several criticisms of the American Revolution for not being democratic. And I'll open it up for any of the panelists who would like to respond to that. So maybe to recap, what's the role of the democracy in the bourgeois revolution versus the proletarian revolution? How do they differ?
Just to pick up on something that August Nimtz has said about this issue of social democrats. And it seems like in the middle of the 19th century, when you have like French Republicans, which at the time are seen as the most sort of advanced like political forces of liberal thought, rejecting sovereignty in the people while upholding liberal values. That here there's this expression of democracy in crisis, and that the crisis is not in the minds of these people, but rather within civil society itself. So that when Tocqueville rejects sovereignty in the people, what he really means, and not because I know what's in his head, but because he's saying in the speeches, is that he's rejecting that the people are demanding full employment. That it seems to him that what the social democrats are a challenge to private property. And so democracy becomes a problem because within civil society itself, the demands by people express a contradiction within society, an irreconcilable problem between these forces of labor and capital that cannot just be resolved actually, according to Marx, by a return to democracy. Democracy itself becomes a problem because the conflict between labor and capital cannot be worked through democracy itself, but rather, according to Marx, the dictatorship of the proletariat will make the problem of labor and capital conscious, and thus resolve it. And so I guess in response to Aaron's question about this problem of democracy in the middle of the 19th century and the proletariat revolution, that it's the problem of the Bonapartist state, of the attempt actually to resolve the problem of capital and labor by the leadership, by Republican leadership, let's say in France, that shows Louis Blanc, but others like Marx, that democracy has reached a fundamental impasse, and that this impasse is capitalist society.
And if I can add to that, I think it was the 1848 revolutions, Marx's comments about the Constitution that emerged, and he argued that there was this fundamental incompatibility between the interests of capital and the working class. I think that's one of the main, and it's fascinating to read Tocqueville and Marx together on this, because I think they're both in agreement about this reality. I'll take this opportunity to say, since I'll have to leave, but the tyranny of the majority, this was one of Tocqueville's fears. I didn't realize Tocqueville actually, he got the idea from Madison. When he came to do his research, he was able to look at Madison's papers and so on, and it was Madison who raised this question first about the tyranny of the majority, and therefore the need for separation of powers, to put a limit on the majority. And I'm increasingly convinced that the tyranny of the majority is in many ways quite similar. I'm still thinking about it. The dictatorship of the proletariat. So, but I'll have to end it there, and sadly I'll have to depart, and I hope the Q&A goes well. And thanks for
Thank you
inviting
very much for your time, August.
me. Sure, thank you.
Can I just jump in quickly? Just say,
Please,
August,
go ahead.
before you go, I completely agree with you, but that's because Madison and Marx and Tocqueville were all getting it from the same source, which is Aristotle. So they
From who?
Aristotle.
Oh, okay.
So
Okay.
Aristotle just understands democracy to be tyranny of majority, and that's what Marx understands the transitional phase to be.
I think you're right.
The people are the working class.
Right.
They shall rule as a majority over the rest and use their collective power to coercively expropriate the property from the bourgeoisie. It's the proletarian form of dictatorship. Right. So but it happens through the will of the majority, whereas he thinks that the bourgeois form of dictatorship happens through the executive branch, or the state, as it were, that limits and constantly limits and undermines the various undemocratic means, the ability of the majority to actually exercise its will in society. Anyway, I don't want to take up your time, but
that's a good idea. Yeah, good point. Thanks again. Bye now.
Is it all right if I say one thing about the question, the original question?
Absolutely. Yep. Thank you so much, August. I hope you have a great night.
Thank you. Bye now.
Alex, please jump in.
It's related to this, which is what I wanted to say, which is that, because I might depart a little bit from maybe what's been said by Pam, which is that the question was, is there some difference between, I think it was the difference between the bourgeois versus the proletarian form of democracy. And I think, or relationship to democracy in their revolution. And I think there is, and it isn't just one where somehow, the bourgeoisie somehow committed to democracy, but the proletariat, the working class goes beyond it. I think it's a somewhat more complex series of moves, which is in the bourgeois revolution, even to create formal democracy, the bourgeoisie has to call into existence and invoke the people and call it and draw on the powers of the producing classes more broadly. And so they set in motion the agency of the producing and eventually the working class, which means that they are immediately afraid of the very agents that they have brought into being through their calls for democracy. So bourgeois revolutions are generally democratic, but they're democratic only in the more limited sense of announcing that the people are the final authority behind the Constitution, but then they have to constantly create these institutional constraints on the actual exercise of democratic will because they are afraid of the majority. Whereas I think proletarian revolutions are in part simply about trying to create real democracy, create institutions that are not, that allow the people, namely the majority, to exercise its will unchecked by counter-majoritarian institutions like special bodies of armed men, the police, the judiciary, judicial review, executive counterpowers, and so on. So that's why I agree with August. I think dictatorship of the proletariat is just what Marx meant by the majority imposing its will coercively on the rest of society, so that everyone could control the vast majority of the means of production. So I think there's the difference between sort of formal and real democracy here, and not just sort of going past democracy, because the point is real self-rule can only be realized by the working class imposing its will through the state on society.
I just want to make sure, Jamal and Pam, did you guys want to have anything else on this question on the role of democracy before we move on?
Yeah, I think that's a very well-stated conclusion that we've come to about the tyranny of the majority being equatable to the dictatorship of the proletariat. And I think this is why I bristled somewhat at Pam's knocking of Dear Grandpa, because we live—
Stalin or Bernie Sanders?
The one and only Bernie Sanders.
Checking.
We live under a constitutional arrangement that does not allow for, forget real democracy in the sense of dictatorship of the proletariat, it doesn't allow for real democracy in the sense that you see in any other developed country. That is to say that you can't just will a workers' party into existence here. We have tried that many times. The Socialist Party failed, the Communist Party failed, the Farmer Labor Party of Minnesota failed, the Progressive Party, to the extent that it was a workers' party, which it wasn't really, but even that failed, right? Like, there are institutional barriers in place to the formation of workers' parties here. And until those barriers are gone, or significantly reduced, I think that we have to be cognizant of their reality, and we can reject their legitimacy all we like, but they exist. And if our goal is the creation of a working class movement that could conceivably usher in the dictatorship of the proletariat, we have to go about clearing the ground for the emergence of such a movement. And that's not going to be by kind of ignoring electoral politics and just hoping that if we fix enough brake lights or whatever, the working class will self-organize to the point that it can take power. We have to be chipping away at these institutional hurdles to working class organization. And I don't think that from that perspective, the Sanders campaign has been on the balance negative, because I think it has disillusioned a whole generation of working class people with the two-party system in a very visceral way that they may not have been if Bernie Sanders hadn't run and kind of opened this window onto another possible politics.
Pam, do you want to respond to what Alex and Jamal have said, or should we move on to the next question?
I just want to say one thing about democracy, because I don't agree, just to clarify, that the tyranny of the majority is actually equatable with the dictatorship of the proletariat. I think what we are missing here is this notion of a class dictatorship, and how the notion of class is different from just the sort of majority as such. I guess the question, I think it's Engels that calls the revolution one of the most authoritarian things that can happen, and the kind of social transformations that we would need to undergo in order to chip away at necessary labor time and the reorganization of production, and the kind of imposition of a new regime, a new society that would need to come about, which I guess you know, I'm still trying to figure out like what, if anything, for Alex is the difference between just saying democracy and, you know, socialism, and why is it that Marx is talking about the dictatorship of the class, and why put it in this way?
Great, thank you guys. Your next question is going to come from Richard Rubin. Was the French Revolution more radical in any way than the American Revolution? And was there any fundamental difference between them? Would anyone like to jump on that?
I think the French Revolution was clearly radical in one way, which is it was the first time you actually had a communist insurrection. The Babouviste conspiracy of 95-96 was the first actual openly communist insurrection that led the exiles from that insurrection led to the founding of the League of the Just, which became the Communist League, which Marx joined soon after some of the last inheritors of that communist insurrection died. So there's no communist insurrection in the American Revolution, which is to say no attempt to basically create a society in which there were no class barriers to participation in the state, in which most of the means of production were going to be under the productive control of the political community as a whole, in which there was going to be equal labor service, in which production and consumption were basically split. So there was a kind of from each to each aspect to the Babouviste, the communist kind of economic program. And so it's no wonder that Marx and Engels themselves traced their conception of communism back to Babeuf. So in that sense, I think the French Revolution was clearly had more radical elements in it than the American one. I would say the other way in which it takes more revolution is you actually saw the complete liquidation of a class, the destruction of the aristocracy. There's a way in which that happens in the American Revolution by kind of declaring hereditary titles illegal, but there wasn't a fully constituted aristocratic class to defeat and destroy in the American case. So I would say the actual destruction of a class and the moment in which you actually have the first communist insurrection in any modern sense does make the French Revolution more radical and more I suppose more radically revolutionary than the American one.
I think this question's a bit of a trap. I think that, you know, there was, I think in the late, sorry if people are going to see my cat, but she's kind of driving me crazy. In the late 19th century, the sort of progressive historians made this argument that the French Revolution was too radical and that the American Revolution was more akin to the English Revolution, and they tried to sort of separate the two, and we somehow have inherited the kind of posing of these two revolutions to one another. I think Babeuf is very important to understand Marx and the critique of property and the conspiracy of equals, but I think it also maybe we should take into consideration the fact that for Paine, for Thomas Paine, like he thought that like agrarian property could find a sort of emancipatory expression in the United States, that the problem in a sense of property owners as constituting a class of their own or some sort of decision makers, etc., wasn't necessarily the path forward for the United States. And so I think I don't know, I think that it's a bit of a trap because we kind of assume the historical development and conflict of property in capital and labor as already within the 18th century, which I think it's not quite the case. And the second argument would just be like, to some extent, yes, it's more, you know, like kind of radical to get rid of the sort of aristocrats in this way. And yet you could say that in the United States that there was a bit more liberty to like not have these people actually, that you have these popular assemblies and experiments in sovereignty in ways that the French Revolution is not built on these things, right? And so I think it's a bit of a trap, this question.
Okay, excellent. The next two questions I'm going to stitch together. The first of the next set comes from Richard, and then the second one comes from Parker. So the first one is going to be, how do the panelists understand the opposition between Hamilton and Jefferson? Is one preferable to the other? And if so, why? And then the second question from Parker is, how much was Jeffersonian republicanism a continuation or a rejection of the first phase of the American Revolution in the 1790s and first decade of the 19th century, particularly in light of the Haitian Revolution? So Jefferson and Hamilton, and then Jeffersonian republicanism itself.
I mean,
Yeah,
okay.
nobody. Oh, go. No, please go, Pamela. I was just going to break the silence.
Okay. I mean, Hamilton clearly understands the kind of dynamism that is being unleashed in commercial society in ways that I think Jefferson's vision of the Republic is tied to this productive, agrarian, independent producer, and that he sees that what Hamilton sees as the dynamism of commercial society, he considers a threat to undermine this subject of the Republic, the free subject with the time and liberty to think. But Jefferson is not entirely wrong in seeing the problems and threats that this dynamism can present to this project of liberty. But Hamilton is seeing the kind of, I mean, he's much more in agreement with like Thomas Paine in this regard, of seeing the kind of optimism of commerce as bringing about like a new society. However, between the two, and and if we're speaking from the present fetishization of Hamilton, I think that what's forgotten in Hamilton is that he wanted to maintain a place in government, right? Even for aristocracy. He wanted to have a sort of check on this democratic forces. And this is something that would constitute an obstacle even within the idea of liberty of the 18th century, I think, that to fully realize the possibilities for what Marx would call the Second American Revolution, you did have to get rid of primogeniture and entail and things that Jefferson was putting forward in his project, in his political project. And so today, I would say Jefferson is worth rescuing from the bad history and the bad pedagogy of the left. And one should be suspicious about raising Hamilton as some kind of proto-emancipator, where in his own times he was even accused of, he was being called a Tory. Of course, he wasn't a Tory, but there's a reason for that.
Okay, Alex and Jamal, if you guys don't have comments on the Jefferson and Hamilton thing, we'll go ahead, but I'm gonna pause in case.
Yeah, go right ahead.
Okay, great. The next two questions I'm also gonna clump together. The first one is from Fideas. If Lenin and the Bolsheviks could make a mass working class party in Tsarist Russia, why can't we have one in America today, despite the institutional obstacles? And actually, I'm gonna let you guys respond to that one before moving on to Ashley's question.
Sure, I think that at least my answer to that would be that it's actually easier to have a revolution in a more oppressive regime, because it's easier to get people to believe that a revolution is the only way they're going to be able to improve their lives. In a bourgeois democracy like the United States, there is the illusion that you can actually improve things by means of participation in the democratic system and civil society and so forth. So that's why you very, very rarely see proletarian revolutions in bourgeois democracies, and you historically much more frequently see them in aristocratic, dictatorial, autocratic regimes.
I have a somewhat different read of the problem from Jamal on this. I think it's not a question of two different institutions, although there's maybe something there, but just two very different historical periods. So we still live in a period marked by the kind of long-term consequences of the defeat of communism and Marxism. I mean, Lenin is creating the Bolsheviks in time of rising class consciousness, workers having repeated experiences in different countries of their own collective power. It looks in other countries like organized socialist parties that are backed largely by workers are able to win more and more, elections at regional levels and to seize power in various places. So I think that it's not just that people hated the czar, since the other thing about authoritarian governments is they're very good at suppressing dissent and, killing, assassinating leaders and decomposing society. It's that it was a much more broadly revolutionary period, and that the defeat of class consciousness and of more broadly Marxism and ideological conflict by whenever you want to date it, 1989, has had a profoundly disorganizing effect both on the left and on working class more broadly. And it's taken an incredibly long time just to get back to a period where it was sort of acceptable to go around talking about socialism, communism, to even kind of broach these subjects. I mean, we finally got to the point where we don't have to just talk about anti-capitalism, right? I mean, that was sort of the only way in which one could even speak about things like communism in the 1990s and early 2000s, or anti-imperialism, just being against things, as opposed to having some sense of anything that one was for. And it's taken quite a long time to even get out from being completely covered by the shadow of the defeat of Marxism in the left. So I think it's got less to do with the institutions and more to do with the fact that, you don't make history and circumstances of your own choosing. Which isn't to say there aren't all kinds of political errors and mistakes that are or aren't made, but I think we can't overestimate the degree of just disorganization, political and ideological disorientation that came with the end of communism.
I think that we should clarify, and maybe in response to Jamal's sort of earlier provocation about the building the party or not building the party and this kind of proposition, I think that if we're talking about the possibility for socialism, that obviously a conscious working class party is required. But the working class party, it seems to me, was built through the conscious conflicts in civil society by the working class, who became aware of their objective position in society and their common destiny as distinct from their employers through struggle, through union struggle, through organization, and by communists, socialists who were within these organizations and could give meaning to these struggles, could provide a way of understanding class conflict so as to build the possibility for a socialist party. So today, when the argument is made that you just need to somehow create the room for a party, and that by uttering the word socialist, it's thus advancing socialism, I think puts the cart before the horse. And in fact, I mean, this is something that the DSA itself understands thus much. I mean, that there's a recent Jacobin podcast in which this was acknowledged that, you know, i.e. we are putting the cart before the horse, but isn't this a historic opportunity? But I think that it does have to contend with this problem. This idea that one is just going to inject the idea of socialism or the word socialism from somehow within the Democratic Party without building and furthering the desire for socialism and the understanding of what socialism is among the majority of the working classes in the United States. And so that the idea that in the Second International, which, you know, August talking about Lenin sort of brings this up, like what was the Socialist Party during the Second International? What kind of institutions in civil society did it have? It had schools, it had reading groups, it had meetings for working people to make sense of their common struggles so that they could conclude from the conversations with socialists that socialism was necessary, was desired, and was possible. Nothing like that is happening in the political strategy for Bernie Sanders. That's not on the table.
Okay, next question from Ashley. The Farmer Labor Party failed because it was maneuvered into the New Deal coalition. Do you agree or disagree?
It was maneuvered into the New Deal coalition because otherwise it would have lost to the Republicans via vote splitting. And that's the problem with first past the post, right? Under an alternative electoral arrangement, the Farmer Labor Party could have continued as an independent workers' party without folding itself into the Democratic Party. And this is similarly why a robust workers' party like the Socialist Party of Eugene Debs was able to be crushed electorally after having some, early flourishing in states like Oklahoma and so forth, because the electoral system is set up specifically to force working class parties to choose between continued independence as working class parties and folding themselves into larger bourgeois coalitions. They inevitably choose the latter, which results in their extinction as independent political forces until socioeconomic conditions permit them to rise again, in which case the cycle repeats. And yeah, that would be my answer to that.
I'm gonna just pause for a second. Okay, go ahead.
Well, now I had a question. I mean, just so are you proposing that, because I've heard this on the left, that there ought to be a change first, a sort of step-by-step like transformation of the electoral system, and that this in fact could be the precondition, sort of necessary precondition for a socialist party? Or is that, because I'm getting the impression that you might be arguing this?
Yeah, and I have argued that in the past. I think it's a necessary precondition. I don't think it's a sufficient condition. That is to say, a lot more needs to happen. But I think if the stars align, we get an active working class movement. It organizes a working class party, such as the working class party that Eugene Debs was the leader of for a while, or the Communist Party and so forth during its heyday. We're not going to actually get anywhere if that party is bound to the same political institutions that killed the Socialist Party and the Communist Party. So yeah, I would say that the left needs to take very seriously the task of clearing space for a working class party that may or may not emerge in our lifetimes. And at the moment, there's a lot of poo-pooing of the essential characteristics of American institutions that make that a very difficult task, as opposed to actually trying to set about finding ways to change them.
Could you still have a constitutional convention in the 21st century? Like, couldn't socialists lead the struggle for constitutional convention? I wonder to what extent this strategy that you've just proposed assumes that, first of all, it assumes that working people want socialism, which, I mean, do working people in America want socialism? I don't know. But I guess I'm just curious about the sort of, I don't want to call it like a technocratic solution, but definitely one that emphasizes that you need to sort of reform the institutions of government as a way of, as you put it, sort of clearing the space. But what is it being cleared for? Like, how is that end being built, the goal of socialism, if that's what's being cleared for? And I actually am curious, like what Alex thinks is like, couldn't the socialists lead like the fight for a 21st century constitutional convention on the basis for like the desire for socialism? I don't know.
I think it would depend immensely on whether this kind of a movement was the organic expression of large numbers of workers wanting democratic control over their lives, or whether it was just the current institutional reform package of a particular party that happens to win elections. So that to me is a whole difference. So you do have moments in American history where you do have masses of workers, or sort of farmers and workers and petty producers, but large numbers of working people in some hegemonic alliance actually realizing institutional changes through amendment processes and actually constitutional conventions, but making the income tax constitutional or direct election of senators. These were organic expressions in the late 19th, early 20th century of much wider social movements for greater democratic control. And I think that's quite different than, maybe to kind of slightly caricature the opposite position, but which is that we can't have those mass movements until we get the institutional changes. I think that no serious leadership of no serious program of an independent working class politics could avoid the questions of of democratic institutions. What is the actual political form we're going to give to ourselves, and how is it we want to conduct our business? That's going to have to be part of any serious independent working class politics. So it's going to have to be in there. But as an actual politics, it's going to matter a lot whether it sees itself as the organic expression of millions of working class people wanting this, or whether it sees itself as somehow coming before. Because I think the other problem with seeing it as somehow like a necessary precondition for any working class politics is it's revolutionary. Under what circumstances are you going to get a revolutionary democratic change of these institutions without the working class already being signed up? You're never going to get it. I can't imagine. I can almost distantly imagine something like getting rid of the Electoral College. That's perhaps I could imagine that. But getting rid of the Senate, overthrowing the Supreme Court, those are really revolutionary democratic things, and most people have to be signed up for it anyway. So to see these things as sort of necessary preconditions for a mass movement seems to me to just get them backwards.
I think you're right about overthrowing the Senate and the Supreme Court. And to the point of the Constitutional Convention, I think if you have enough popular support for a constitutional convention, you may as well just overthrow the government, right? Like there would not be much of a point in a constitutional convention if you had that level of popular support. Well, that's not really what I'm referring to when I say necessary precondition. I'm referring to specifically those elements of the system that hamper the formation of third parties, because I think this is what I mean by clearing the space for working class political mobilization. We can't mobilize outside of the two parties, and we can't mobilize in a third party because rightly no one takes third parties seriously because they can't win. All they do is spoil, right? This is the element that if we reform, I consider a necessary precondition of further mobilization. It's also the easiest element to reform because first past the post is not enshrined in the Constitution. This can be reformed at the state level, at the municipal level, whatever. This is easy enough to do.
Look, I know what you're saying, but to me the problem is this. There is enormous legal repression of third parties, but I spent considerable portions of the period between January and early March canvassing for Bernie Sanders because whatever, it's not that interesting why I personally was doing it. But I'd say one of the primary experiences of that process in primarily Latino East Boston, in Chelsea, Massachusetts, in Manchester, New Hampshire, and even ended up in Charleston a little bit, was this is an incredibly politically disorganized society in which it turned out not even the Sanders campaign, which was so supposedly a kind of not just mobilizing, but organizing campaign, spend any serious amounts of time trying to politically organize the working class. That it's, that people should basically, politicians show up a month or two ahead of time to try and convince people to get their votes. But I'm actually not convinced it's so impossible to organize large segments of the working class simply because third parties are legally repressed. It's actually an incredibly politically disorganized society in which both parties have very thin political relationships with their own constituencies. And that the problem is as much a profound failure of any of the alternatives to really take seriously the process of trying to organize on a monthly and annual basis these segments of society. So I think the kind of, and this sort of technocratic idea, well, if we can just get these smaller changes, yeah, but the Democrats and Republicans know that that's going to be the consequences of changing these laws. So why would they ever agree to do it? They never agree to do it because they've spent the last 100 years trying to change the electoral laws to make these things impossible.
All right, Jamal, I'm just going to let you respond super briefly, and then we're going to go to the next couple of questions. But go ahead, I'll let you respond really briefly.
The answer to that is ballot initiatives, which is something that we've inherited from the progressives of the early 19th century in a lot of states, including California and other important states. So you wouldn't necessarily need Democratic and Republican Party buy-in for third-party friendly reforms.
Okay, great. The next two questions are both about the 1619 project. So the first one comes from Shane, asking from Australia. Why has the New York Times 1619 project been so divisive on the US left? Listened to the New York Times podcast and seemed a liberal account that you might expect from the New York Times. Second question about the 1619 project. Why do you think the 1619 project is appealing to people on the left today? Given most of the panelists seem to agree it's misleading, what would you say to leftists who find credence in the 1619 project? And what are they fundamentally missing about the American Revolution? I'm going to tack onto this the last bit of Ed's question, which is really well phrased because I think it fits here. Basically, Ed is asking about, what would be the rational kernel expressed by characterizing 1776 as a counter-revolution?
With regard to the first questions about why the 1619 project has been so controversial on the left, why so many people have on the American left have basically adopted its viewpoint, and that's because the American left is full of self-branded leftists who politically are indistinguishable from identitarian liberals. This is something that has marked the American left ever since the 60s and 70s. It's still the case. You have a lot of people in the United States who consider themselves to be on the left who in any other country would not be considered leftists because fundamentally they're not Marxists, they don't believe in class politics, and so on and so forth.
Okay, thank you. Alex?
I find the 1619 project a kind of puzzling phenomenon because until not that long ago, this view that the American Revolution was really about slavery was actually a very marginal view promoted only by certain kinds of leftists. And it was a view that I think through the 1990s would have been completely rejected because it would have been seen basically as unpatriotic, inconsistent with basic, commitment to American values. Liberals would have had no time for it. So what's really striking to me about the 1619 project is how quickly a very minority view, I mean, there was a historian, I think his name's Gerald Horne, I mean, who'd been writing about these books. He's writing this kind of argument, first shows up, I think, in the 1960s, but it's really, even to call it sectarian makes it sound like too wide a view. I mean, it was a very unusual view. It was very common to be heard by sort of, you know, British historians because it was bound up with a certain kind of friendly imperial rivalry. But what's striking to me is that all of a sudden it gets embraced not just by the, not really by the left, but by the liberal commentariat. And there, I think it's because it's a way of, it can get a foothold in a certain partial truth, which is that it's certainly true that some of the people signed up to the American Revolution were slaveholders who were worried about the fate of their powers over their slaves because there were some signs that imperial England, that the metropole, would threaten their prerogatives over their slaves. But that partial truth, to turn it into the truth about the American Revolution, I think speaks something more about the consumers of it's a kind of historical expression, I think, of a kind of what's suddenly become a kind of fashionable white guilt. So very quickly, I think what went from being a completely unpatriotic, wacko view of the American Revolution was seized on as a way of, I think, in a kind of post-Black Lives Matter situation, for people to, as a way of kind of signaling a morally appropriate form of white guilt that doesn't really require anyone to come to terms with anything in particular about present institutions or do anything in particular, except to put on parade your own, your kind of a form of virtue signaling. And that's what's at stake in taking this partial truth and turning it into the essence and reality of the American Revolution, and suddenly changing who has authority to speak about these events, and how it is that we're supposed to feel about them. So that's why I think it's this jolting shift in which interpretations of the American Revolution suddenly are fashionable and supposed to show up and supposed to be widely accepted, really has much more to do with this kind of shift in the mood of certain kind of liberal culture and the culture of professional classes around putting on parade a kind of white guilt with, I think, little political upshot, little political meaning in the end. Doesn't really ask anything of us. And it's not any closer, it seems to me, to the truth of the actual event.
I mean, the rational kernel of calling 1776 a counter-revolution is that the left today is counter-revolutionary. And so, of course, it's going to call the American Revolution a counter-revolution. To Ed's question. But I think that, you know, actually, I was surprised how relatively uncontroversial it had become. I mean, really, I mean, we're talking about, like, you know, Gordon Wood and some other historians going on the World Socialist website. And, you know, and this is the New York Times, which, you know, I guess after 2016, what are we to expect from the New York Times? But I mean, I spoke to a lot of colleagues in university, and they seem to be like, well, like, don't you think ultimately it has a point? And, you know, when I kind of avoided reading the articles because I was like, oh God, like, what am I subjecting myself to? And then I sat down one evening and, like, read the whole thing. And I was just, like, appalled. I mean, they make such statement as, like, you know, like, Black people, like, try to emancipate themselves, like, without the help of white people. And I was like, what is this, like, bizarre, like, Black separatist, like, idea that now has become popularized? Like, what, like, do people not know who, like, Charles Sumner, Wendell Phillips, I mean, like, so many, William Garrison, like, all of these people that were part of abolitionist movements that were trying to bring together, like, Black workers, that were organizing Black workers that were being used as strike breakers. I mean, there's just this massive amount of history that's completely forgotten. But I think the politics that it represents, or that it reflects, is this kind of urban liberal elite that doesn't have to appeal to the working class anymore, because of course any socialist worth his salt in the United States that's going to organize among the American workers is going to uphold the American Revolution and the promise of the emancipation of labor of 1776. And without that, you know, we're no longer interested in the mobilization of the American working class. And so, if anything, it's the victory of the kind of urban elite speaking to itself that's reflected in the New York Times 1619 project.
Great. I think we have time for just two more batches of questions that they keep popping up here. So I just want to make sure that we do address them. The first two questions are both about the Indigenous population. So the first one comes from Richard. What stake, if any, did the Indigenous peoples of North America have in the American Revolution? And the second one comes from Jan. A similar question was already posed, so I'm just reminding you. I would like to hear about the role or non-role of the North American Indigenous people in the American Revolution, or at all in the creation of the American nation state. In what sense does this compromise or not how we should understand the American Revolution? Does anybody want to jump on that one? You can just have one panelist respond.
I mean, it depends on, I think the answer to this question depends on whether you believe what at least some of us have been saying, which is that the ideals of freedom and independence that were part of the American Revolution, whether they can be taken up and used by groups who were originally dominated, exploited, or nearly exterminated by those original events. So just as Frederick Douglass and many early abolitionists before him didn't think that that we just abandon all of the revolutionary emancipatory elements of the American Revolution because it led to, among other things, institutions that protected and entrenched slavery. I think there is a reason why Native Americans could view it in the same way. How they should appropriate it, what they should look to, whether it is a form of total political independence from the American nation state, or joining up with all other elements of those oppressed by the currently existing nation states in open question. I myself don't really see what political independence for Native Americans means in the United States anymore. I don't see what it can mean. That's not to excuse the extraordinary crimes committed against them for centuries, but I don't see what it could mean. So I would think that it could be join with others who want to advance and you truly universalize the revolutionary possibilities of the American Revolution through joining up with all the other oppressed groups in society to try and take control of that society together. That would be my thought. I understand why there would be groups who so thoroughly, given the history, so thoroughly distrust any such alliance with anyone that they would look elsewhere. But I don't know what that alternative path could possibly look like. I just don't know what it could look like. Don't see what a truly independent nation state for Native Americans would look like at this point in history. So that would be my thought.
Yeah, I think that the question of self-determination for Native American changes historically, depending on how integrated Native Americans have become to the rest of the population. So, for example, I guess one example from history is George Henry Evans, who was a Northern Jeffersonian and who called for the formation of a red state as well as a black state that then would have democratic relations, right, with the sort of self-governance of working people. So he argued that there ought to be autonomy and that Creek lands that were taken up by Jackson should be given back to those people so that they could distribute them in small plots in this kind of agrarian imagination. And so there is an example, at least in the early 19th century, of Northern Jeffersonians who are using the the ideas of the American Revolution and who are saying that people deserve rights to the land and deserve rights to self-government, etc. But I think that question, I agree that it has changed now in the present. I'm not sure what that would mean today. I think that you'd have to organize an American labor movement, which would be by necessity, in order to be successful in the United States, a multi-ethnic, multicultural movement. And I think that those who go back to this kind of separatist notions are actually an obstacle to realizing that potential.
I'm just going to pause real quick. Jamal, did you want to jump in on that, or should we?
No, I agree with Pam. I think she had the right of it.
Okay, great. And I think the last batch of questions is an excellent way to tie off our discussion. So these are, the first one's going to be from Audrey. What are the prospects for socialist revolution today if the left actively rejects the revolutionary character of 1776? The next question, similarly from Atticus, the Constitution is a living document. Is the presence and effectiveness of the left a determinant of the life of the Constitution? In other words, does the Constitution have any relevance today as a revolutionary document, or is it purely status quo? And bear with me, just the last one from Forrest Taylor. All panelists, do you believe it would be helpful to leftists in the US to use the rhetoric of patriotism, even if it is not totally honest? So those three questions. So I'm going to just repeat Audrey's first one just in case. What are the prospects for socialist revolution today if the left actively rejects the revolutionary character of 1776?
I think the first and the third question are related, and they're related to the class composition of what we call the American left. The prospects for a revolution, for left political success generally, are very low at the present stage, in large part because the left has no working class base. In order to get a working class base, we have to be able to resist the temptation of anti-patriotism, of whining about the revolution and the Constitution and so on and so forth. So yeah, I would say that I agree with the underlying thrust of both of those questions, that this is a problem for the left. We have to find a way to speak in a language that is comprehensible to the vast bulk of the population, instead of spinning our wheels, in these kind of cloistered academic and media circles where we're basically just talking to professional managerial class professionals and so on and so forth.
I'm going to invite Alex and Pam to chime in. And just as a reminder, so it doesn't get lost, there's also Atticus's question on, does the Constitution have relevance as a revolutionary document?
I mean, I'm really not sure how to answer some of these questions. So, I think the Constitution certainly has relevance as a revolutionary document, insofar as, for one, we are constantly, the political institutions that govern our lives are continuously justified by reference to the Constitution, which immediately raises the question, what is the authority of the Constitution? And the authority of it is not that it's just a traditional document, it's that it's the product of a some kind of act of popular sovereignty in a period of revolution. So it's, I agree with August that it's also a kind of counter-revolutionary document within that revolution, but it just raises continuously questions. What is it that the people want today? And that is a revolutionary question to ask. It doesn't always lead in revolutionary directions, but it is a revolutionary question to ask. As for patriotism and the future of socialist revolution, I think it's perfectly plausible that you could have a communist revolution in which most people don't have the correct view of the American Revolution. I'm not, I think that I don't even really know quite how, they have to have something like the attitudes that and views that we attribute to why some of us value the American Revolution, but they can get the American Revolution wrong. I don't think that, you're going to just clearly, absolutely, completely get revolution wrong if there's aspects of American Revolution you see differently. However, I think absolutely you will fail at socialism if you get committed to patriotism. I think that what is of value in the American Revolution is that it was one quite important instance in a whole North Atlantic and South Atlantic series of revolutions. It was part of a whole age and period of democratic revolution across the globe. And that this is part of what was valued about it, is that it was a democratic revolution. There's nothing special or great, I think, about patriotically seizing it as something special and great about the United States. I think that leads away from certain kinds of international thinking and a proper way of understanding internationalism as different ways in which self-governing groups of people relate to each other, as seeking the same thing. So I would say patriotism is a bad direction ahead, but appreciating the properly revolutionary inheritance of self-rule and popular sovereignty is in some way necessary, but not in some really obvious logical sense that you need it. You need to get the American Revolution exactly right in order to have revolution. But I certainly don't think we're anywhere near any of that kind of stuff now. I agree with Jamal on that.
Great. I'm going to ask all of these speakers just to take maybe 1 or 2 minutes if you want to offer some closing remarks. And Pam, sorry you didn't get a chance to address that. If you could roll that into your closing remarks if you wanted to respond. So maybe we can start with Jamal and then Alex and then Pam.
Sure. I guess I would say if anyone is interested in further discussion of the problem of third-partyism versus democratic entryism, how that relates to the DSA, how that relates to the American left, I found the article, A Socialist Party in Our Time by Jared Abbott and Dustin Questella to be very interesting. But other than that, I have nothing more to add.
Is it me? I'm not sure who's next. Me. I guess closing, I'll say that I think one of the reasons I've been trying to emphasize the kind of democratic aspects of the American Revolution is that I think that the problem of class consciousness today isn't just a kind of problem of workers being aware that they're workers, or workers being aware that they have interests in common with other workers, but a more specific question of the working class as a whole desiring self-determination. And it's that particular form that class consciousness takes, to be aware of the way in which in a capitalist society, your life is determined for you, but that there's another way of organizing and shaping society such that you determine the shape of society. It's the demand for that kind of demand for freedom that is, I think, really fundamental to real class consciousness. And that's why there is a kind of organic connection between that and democracy more generally. And why I think today it is of a special value, particularly important to defend democracy and the idea of people ruling themselves, because of that organic connection with what I think actual revolutionary class consciousness is about. So that's sort of what I'd say.
Okay, I think, I mean, again, I think that there is this need to appeal to masses of working people for the possibility of socialist revolution. And I think that one thing that the United States in its history has is that working people in America, their popular belief is that they're born with inalienable rights, and that this is in fact enshrined in the Constitution. The demand for liberty, if socialists are to advance it, can mobilize this popular memory and this real historical legacy within the United States for the purposes of advancing socialism. I don't think that there needs to be a lie or some kind of ruse. I think that it's there. I think that when we talk about Jefferson and Paine and the emancipation of labor in the 18th century, I think that it is connected, as Mark said, to the project of the emancipation of labor. How that happens, though, I think is key. and the how in terms of politics, right? That's the important bit. And I just said briefly, I mentioned the 1930s and the sort of Stalinization of the legacy of the American Revolution, because I think that if the history of 1776 is used as a kind of propaganda to reconciliate or to bring together the desire for socialism with the current capitalist parties in the state, then we actually undermine the possibility of creating independent working class organizations. And by independent working class organizations, I don't just mean creating this mythical party, but like the Second International showed us, that these independent working class organizations were a way of making sense of the phenomenon of class conflict in society. They included all sorts of things. There wasn't one key party to unlock the potential of society. And in fact, maybe this is the bad inheritance of the Stalinist left that we still are haunted by today. So I think, you know, to wrap up, we do a disservice to the potential within the United States for socialism to do away with the legacy of 1776. And if there is a reclaiming of democracy, let it at least be social democracy. Social democracy of the mid-19th century, of the conflict of property against capital within civil society, of the impossible demand for employment for all, of workers joining together to demand full employment. And so if that can be part of the social democratic project in the present, then I'm all for it. And I am, of course, for the class dictatorship of the proletariat, but it's not on the table. So maybe we can find a way of talking about social democracy and how we might articulate it today.
Great. Thank you so much. I'd like to give just a massive, massive thank you to all of our panelists, Jamal, Alex, Pamela, August, who's unfortunately no longer here. Also, unfortunately, the massive round of applause we would have given you in a live event is going to have to be virtual this evening. But on behalf of Platypus, on behalf of our attendees, thank you very much. For the audience, before you guys jump, thank you very much for joining us this evening. We will have a discussion right after this panel concludes. The Zoom link for that discussion, where we'll be reflecting on the panel, we'll be reflecting on the questions and answers, and then on the opening remarks of the speakers. That Zoom link is right in that chat box for you guys to just hop into. Also, you know, if you have a response to what you heard tonight, which didn't fit in the limitations of the Q&A box, and you would like to, you know, flesh out your thoughts on it, perhaps you'd like to write a response or review for the Platypus Review. And if that's the case and you have a reflection on this panel, we would love to hear from you. So please send an email to editor@platypus1917.org. And to remind you, we have panels live on Zoom tomorrow, and the details can also be found at the link in the chat box. Everyone, thank you again so much, and have a great night. And please, everyone, take care.
Thanks, Wante.
All right. Thank you, Jamal. Thank you, Alex. And thank you, Pam, again. You guys were awesome. And no logistics problems. Wonderful.
Thanks, guys.
Yeah, it looked like we had like 120 or so people.
Yeah,
for
yeah.
most of it. So really good group.
All right.
All right.
That's great. Thanks a lot